I got news for you, man. If you aren't squatting ATG, then your squats don't count. What's up, guys? Enkiri here, and today I want to talk about range of motion. Some people strive to maximize it, others strive to minimize it, and still others fall somewhere squarely in the middle. Personally, I've undergone a pretty sharp evolution in my own views regarding range of motion on the major compound exercises primarily over these last few years. So I want to discuss kind of why I think this evolution occurred, because things have kind of come full circle for me in many respects in the last decade or so, where I sort of went from a maximalist when it came to range of motion, at least on my squats, and then shifted over to being kind of more of a minimalist, and then moved back to kind of being more of a maximalist again. Now, I don't make this video to tell you guys that you should be training exactly like me, or that my personal reasons for doing something means that you should all be doing those things as well. But I do make this video to showcase the evolution in my thought process over time, and to provide information regarding my own experiences on both sides of the fence, so that you guys can see the potential merits and potential pitfalls of each different perspective. So with all of that in mind, let's jump into it. So range of motion is actually a pretty contentious topic in the weight training world. You have some prominent figureheads such as the KneesOverToesGuy and Dr. Israetel, who often espouse the merits of using large ranges of motion where possible. The KneesOverToesGuy in reference to how it potentially affects health and performance, and Dr. Mike in reference to how it impacts strength and hypertrophy primarily. In recent history, a relatively new niche has also sort of opened up and emerged and gained popularity, where you have guys who basically kind of combine mobility training into their strength training, right? And these individuals tend to encourage not just large ranges of joint motion, but actually attempting to enhance and subsequently maximize exercise range of motion over a variety of different movements during the training process, even into what are some potentially extreme positions. And then kind of on the flip side of this coin, you have guys like Dr. Joel Seedman, who I'm 99.99% convinced at this point is seriously, legitimately just trolling everybody. But you have guys like Dr. Joel, who scream repeatedly that large or even moderate ranges of motion under load are bad and destructive, right? And that the optimal way to train basically involves performing every large compound exercise through approximately 1/3 or less of its natural range of motion. That's Dr. Joel in particular. You also see the act of range of motion minimization within a particular rule set very prolifically in the sport of powerlifting. Obviously, people who compete here have to still move the bar a certain way. So instead of just shortening the range of motion by not moving the bar as far, they maneuver their bodies in a particular way in order to minimize the range of motion. So you mostly see this kind of thing on the bench press and the deadlift, right? Because the shorter ranges of motion on these lifts often can lead to more weight being lifted. And this issue has become so bad in recent history that the IPF even implemented a rule in order to try to enforce a minimum range of motion on the bench press. Now, in terms of the advice that I give to most people, I generally fall somewhere in between these two extremes, while incorporating aspects of those maximal range of motion training ideas into some of what I do. So we always start with something manageable, right? And then on certain movements, we maintain what I would consider to be a moderate, relatively natural range of motion, while focusing on building intensity or volume or both over time. Whereas on other types of movements, we will keep that intensity and that volume relatively static, and instead, at least initially, we focus on comfortably building up the range of motion first and foremost. Not generally into anything extreme with most people, right? But certainly into much fuller ranges of motion than what you often see. With myself, However, I've begun to do things a little bit differently, and I have actually been striving to vastly increase and maximize the range of motion on many of my big compound exercises to the point of what many would actually consider to be extreme, right? And I'm doing this, I have been doing this in an effort to ensure high levels of strength even in those extreme joint positions. And what I have noticed by doing this, primarily in my hips and in my shoulders, is that I am both more mobile and in less pain on average. I can move my hips and my shoulders into all sorts of positions that I simply couldn't before, and I can do so without pain or discomfort. See, for a good while, I had fallen into the idea of simply maximizing how much weight that I could move on the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift, right? I wanted to maximize my powerlifting total, which did over time, lead to reducing the range of motion on these lifts where feasible. So I took a moderately wide grip on my bench and I arched as much as I could, which isn't to say very much because I couldn't really arch all that high, but still I tried to do it as much as I could. I cut my training squats as high as I possibly could while still being able to hit passable depth in competition. And I got pretty good at a relatively wide stance sumo deadlift as well. So that kind of thing, right? And I got very strong this way. I deadlifted 585, weighing just 155 pounds at the time. I squatted 530 and I benched 315. But over time, over a period of several years, I became very stiff and I became very sore. My shoulders were often achy. I had lost quality overhead positioning, something I had previously mastered. My hips were brittle, they were sore as hell, and they were stiffer than the Tin Man. This is also when I tore my labrum by squatting every day to parallel or slightly higher. If I go back and I look at the squats from that time period, they were all not even competition depth. They were slightly above competition depth. Whereas in the past, when I had been doing that squat every day sort of thing, I had done it ATG style. I took all my squats as deep as I could, and I had no issues at that time. Is that a coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. Now, it also used to take me like 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer on squat day just to get ready to put the empty bar on my back when I was stiff like this, when I used to cut the range of motion like this. However, once I started to shift my emphasis onto greater ranges of motion, onto taking all my lifts and reps through the greatest range of motion that I could, that is when things really started to change for the better. So the way I kind of went about this with upper body work and horizontal pressing in particular was I initially just stopped bench pressing with my feet on the floor pretty much altogether, right? I started doing Larson presses instead with my feet up in the air, which necessitates a smaller arch. And like I said, even though my arch was never that crazy, a Larson press basically forces you into an even smaller arch. With that, or after that, kind of following that, I started doing more of my flat presses with moderate and close grips as opposed to the wider grip that I had used to hit my PR in competition. From there, I started to work more overhead pressing variations again in place of those horizontal and bench press variations. I eventually progressed that into behind the neck presses, something I've fallen in love with, and even behind the neck Z presses. So pressing overhead from behind the neck while seated flat with your butt flat on the floor. That requires an incredible amount of mobility through the hamstrings, the thoracic spine, and the shoulders as well, along with obviously large degrees of core strength. With my calisthenics exercises, I started to push for greater and greater ranges of motion, both on my push-ups as well as on my dips, really forcing my shoulders and my scapula to move into realms that they had never experienced at all before, and to learn how to pull out of those positions safely, right? To keep themselves stable and produce large amounts of force out of these extreme joint positions safely. For example, I just did this pause dip the other day with 140 pounds strapped to my dipping belt. I sat in the bottom there as deep as I could for about 2 or 3 seconds. My shoulders are stretched as deep as they can possibly go in the bottom of a dip. And then with lower body work, one of the first things I started trying to do was master the pistol squat, ass to grass, as low as I could go on one leg. It took a little bit of time, and then I got to a point where I was able to hit like 8 or 10 reps per leg without any additional load. I also began performing the majority of my heavy bilateral squat work using ass to grass variations, always squatting as deep as I could go, as opposed to parallel squatting variations. So I started taking my front squats just as deep as I could go. Once again, for example, I started incorporating ATG pause front squats, as well as ATG pause back squats. I used ATG pin squats, or I used pin squats as a segue to build back into these depths once again, right? So I started from a position where the pins were about parallel, maybe a little bit below. After a little while, I took that down a notch, which on my squat rack happens to be 2 inches per pin, right? So I took it down a notch. After another little while, I went down another notch, and then a little while after that, I went down one final notch. And that third notch down from where I started is really as deep as my hip anatomy allows me to go. But it is a solid 6 inches more range of motion than what I had started with initially a few months prior, which is very substantial on a squat as well as in the bedroom. And now, after undergoing that process, I can squat comfortably to these depths using pretty much any of my chosen squat variations, which are myriad. I've got like 10 or 20 different variations that I can pick from on any given day. More importantly, it takes me now less than 5 minutes to warm up my hips, knees, and ankles when I get into the gym before I'm ready to start actually squatting, actually putting the bar on my back and putting weight on it. After I get loosened up, limbered up, less than 5 minutes later, I've got 95 pounds on the bar. I'm ready to get started. Within 15 minutes after getting into the gym, I'm basically up to 90% or higher on the bar, and I'm typically done squatting altogether after 20 or 25 minutes in the gym. Along with that, part of that is because I can comfortably take bigger jumps in weight now than I used to be able to take. I couldn't take big jumps when I was super stiff before because my body just couldn't handle it, right? Now that I'm limber, the big jumps in weight don't impact me as much. I'm ready for them because I'm always ready, basically. The rotational capacity of my hips has opened up once again, just kind of organically. I can sit Indian style on the floor again, an ability that I had lost in previous years because of how stiff that my hips had gotten. I can tumble around on the floor with my son without feeling like a stiff bag of logs or getting pinches and aches in my hips every time that I try to rotate or move around on the floor. So for me, seeking maximal range of motion in these compound exercises and calisthenics movements has really been quite the boon. It has allowed me to recover mobility capacity that I had lost without making much of a concerted effort to recover it. It basically just kind of came back organically, and it has helped my joints to feel better across a wide variety of positions as well. So now I once again have abilities that I had lost that I had when I was younger, but I now possess those same abilities while also possessing a much stronger, more powerful, and more resilient body overall. It's also just much more badass when you can pull off a heavy squat or dip or overhead press from an extreme and compromised position, one that you know would tear most people's connective tissues in half. So there has been great value in this maximal range of motion training, in seeking these maximal ranges of motion and extreme positions for me. All that said, I still can't discount the value that I was able to attain from my powerlifting days, right? Where I was cutting the ranges of motion. That was part of my strength journey, and training in that fashion for a number of years is in part how I was able to achieve the level of strength that I was able to achieve. And I do believe that shortening the ranges of motion, as I did back then, played a role in me being able to achieve this level, right? That there is still something to be said about feeling out and moving a particular weight, even if the range of motion is shorter. Even deliberate partials can be part of a good, solid training program and can be used to help make you stronger, in part by conditioning the nervous system, forcing it to acclimate to heavier loads. By using more advantageous positioning and shorter ranges of motion, though, as you often do in powerlifting, I believe that you can make your body stronger such that when you do begin training with the disadvantageous positioning and using larger ranges of motion and more extreme joint positions, that you'll be able to build more strength in these positions than you would have otherwise been able to build if you had never forayed into that shorter range of motion training. In my opinion, these things they can act symbiotically. Now, obviously, you still have to account for the risk of training in deep joint ranges with extreme positions, especially if that's something that you've been neglecting to do so, right? You have to be sure to build into these more extreme positions properly over time. Otherwise, it's simply a really great way to hurt yourself very quickly and potentially very badly. But the point really is that there is potential value to be garnered from both sides here. I have attained the total level of physical capacity that I have attained because of the totality of my journey. And I wouldn't have attained it if I hadn't played all sides at some point or the other. And I firmly believe that. Now, a better way to go about this process would be to incorporate aspects from both sides relatively frequently rather than neglecting particular aspects for years on end, as I have personally done in the past. Now, this way, if you were always sure to incorporate aspects every now and then, you would ensure that none of the physical qualities were ever lost altogether and needed to be regained, because it's much easier to maintain a physical quality than it is to regain it. It's also much easier to build one when you're starting from here instead of starting from all the way back here. So taking care to stay well-rounded and not neglect full range of motion at the expense of shortened range of motion, and vice versa, is going to go a very long way to ensuring smoother, more pain-free sailing as somebody builds their physical capacity slowly over time. So if I could go back and do it all over myself, this is how I would do it. But that is the beauty of hindsight, my friends. It is, after all, 2020. Now, before I close out the video, I do feel it's important to note that this whole thing is based on my own experience, right? So you may not care about being able to produce extreme force out of extreme joint positions, and you may not care about being highly mobile either. On the flip side, you may just want to be a supple leopard, and you may not care at all about moving really big weights or moving really big weights in those extreme positions. You may also find that your mileage varies with this approach, right? Maybe ATG squatting doesn't actually cure your hip pain or improve your hip mobility at all, like it did for me. Maybe instead it just does the opposite and makes your hips achy. There are a lot of factors involved one way or the other that can change the outcomes here. But in my personal experience, utilizing full and even extreme ranges of motion in much of my training has really just been incredibly positive for me, and has caused me to really rethink how I view range of motion across the board on most of my big compound movements, and really the spectrum of possibilities that potentially exist by utilizing different ranges of motion even on these same exercises, right? So kind of like what I was talking about on the pin squats, using the same squat, but now you have 4 or 5 different ranges of motion that you train that same exercise at, as opposed to just viewing each movement as a single non-malleable entity. Anyway, it's all I got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found it informative. It's a little bit esoteric, I think, but I think there's a pretty good bit of value here for those who are willing to pay attention and soak it all in. So if you found it helpful, be sure to share it around and spread the good word. Please remember to smash the like button before you go. Leave me some love in the comments down below. Check out EnkiriEliteFitness.com for online coaching and training programs. And as always, keep training hard. I will catch you guys next time.